Well, today's something a little different on the podcast. We're going to deal with two topics, both in the news, both in front of Parliament, and both cases where words really matter. A little bit later, we'll talk with Dr. Dwight Newman. He is the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Rights. He's a constitutional law expert. We're going to look at the question of UNDRIP, Bill C-15, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Very complicated issue. But before we do all that, we want to come back to one of our favorite topics here, Bill C-10. What is going on? The internet was going to be this unprecedented tool for communication and commerce and democratization. The more information you had, the wiser the choices you would be able to make. Instead, it's become a zone of surveillance, not just by big tech owners, but now, if you look at this piece of legislation, by the government itself. So today, why free speech matters and why censorship is dangerous. And when you're watching what's going on in the House of Commons and the gong show that it's the Heritage Committee, you have good reason to be concerned. So we've gone back to Peter Menzies, former editor-in-chief and publisher of the Calgary Herald. He spent 10 years on the CRTC, this final 4 as vice chair of telecommunications, and he's currently a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So welcome back, Peter. Thank you for letting us give this another go and seeing if we can shed some light on it. Thanks.
Always a pleasure. Yeah, thanks.
Witnessing what went on this past week in Ottawa has been embarrassing, and it's almost offensive. We've got Liberal members of this committee putting forward amendments in secret, not letting the public or the opposition look at it. I've never seen anything like it. It's a very illegitimate process, if I can put it that way. So we don't really know in the end how this is going to turn out. This ostensibly was supposed to be about changes to the Broadcast Act to look at things like discoverability of Canadian content, which sort of means, can we find enough of it online? And it's turned into this other discussion. So this week, one of your former colleagues, former chair of the CRTC, said, this bill is no way to run a railroad. This is not how you try to regulate matters. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I was just looking back for something else I was working on to 3 years ago when all this got started. Mm-hmm. When it's just 3 years ago this month, almost this week, that they launched the Broadcasting and Telecommunications Legislation Review Panel, right? Yeah. And it all had such bright, shiny, ambition. We were going to modernize everything, the internet would be there. And we've ended up with this sordid ending with this grubby little bill that is just
so great.
Feeding various lobby groups. It's so sad. I mean, to me, it's like a tragic tale of a government all gone wrong, captive by politics instead of good policy, desperate to please certain lobby groups. And then this, as you described, we're passing secret amendments.
Yeah, secret.
In committee, secret, right? From people who promise transparency and net neutrality and all these glowing virtues. And we've got this thuggish finale. It's really jaw-dropping. It really is. I mean, every time you think this can't get worse, it does.
Okay, here's my question, because governments do a lot of crazy stuff at the end of a session in June. This happens every year. Nothing like this, not usually. Maybe they're heading into an election, we don't know. Certainly the Broadcast Act needs to be updated. Certainly there are concerns about how big tech operates and whether it's paying its way or paying its fair share. What do you think they're trying to do with all this crazy stuff?
They're either trying to just jam it all through and get it done and hope they can get it through the Senate and passed before an election is called, or they're just trying to get it through the House and to the Senate so that they could say they've done the best they can. And then come an election, the whole thing dies on the order paper anyway. I mean, they may be making deals around the environmental bill, that sort of thing. Who knows? But it's very undistinguished.
Yes, it certainly is. I think that's a lot, and we talked about this the last time, that the incentive for this came largely from Quebec, that there wasn't enough protection, felt the cultural community there for their content and what they're generating, and they want big tech to be forced to do something about that.
Sure. And people more familiar with political plotting than I am have suggested that they want to make sure they get this through so they can shut down an avenue of attack that the Bloc Québécois might have in a possible election. Because, Quebec is an entirely different figure when it comes to this sort of thing. And there's a long history of a lower level of concern for charter rights if it means defending culture.
Yeah.
So very much to solitudes and very likely politics.
Yep, I think that sort of sums that up. Let's go back to what was sort of key in this bill, which is there was a clause, section 4.1, that said all these new rules that they were going to put in would not apply to user-generated content, meaning you and I having this conversation on a podcast or a blog that I might have, or email exchanges with friends, or say I'm a 19-year-old musician and I want somebody to hear my song out there and discover me. And they said, no, we're not going to touch that. Then abruptly they said, no, that clause is out. Everything's on the table. What do you think that means? How nervous does that make you?
It makes me extremely nervous. It looks like everything was going well for them until they took that out.
Yeah.
And it looks to me like, one more lobby group stepped up and said, oh, just one more thing, right? If you could just take that one out, then, and I think it was the music group. So I'm not sure if it was SOCAN or not, but I can't recall exactly, but it was a music group, which just showed that they were this was all about lobbyists, right? They actually didn't care about the podcasters and all the people who use the internet, right?
Yeah.
You look back at these ambitions of years ago, but this being about consumers and citizens and free democracy and open things and that sort of stuff. This is all just about feeding a certain number of hungry mouths in terms of that, and the fact that they weren't. Guilbeault, as you recall, had a dreadful time trying to explain himself.
Yeah.
On it. Why didn't he just say we did it because musicians wanted us to, right? But instead he just kind of danced around and that sort of stuff. If you're going to be captive to various lobby groups, just be honest about it.
Well, and he went further, and that's where people like me and you, who've spent lifetimes in journalism, the hair raises on the back of our neck when he says we want to be able to decide whether or not criticism of us or political criticism is acceptable. When you start to threaten that you are going to decide what's politically acceptable in terms of exchanges on the internet, then free speech and censorship just starts blaring in the headlights there.
Oh, absolutely. There seems to be. I guess I could say it was naive if I wanted to be generous, but there seems to be a certain oblivion to the idea that any of this is really a problem, right? Yeah. And this is the sort of thing that happens when people, like-minded people, just sit around and agree with each other all the time, right?
Yeah.
And demonize their opponents and never sort of, it never crosses I'm sure it never crosses his mind that Rachel Harder might be onto something.
Yeah.
Right?
This is one of the conservative members of the committee that has really been focusing on this question of free speech, and all of us who use this as a tool and an instrument,
right?
Don't want
people like law professors, like law professors like Michael Geist or Emily Laidlaw, right? Or the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, right? Or open media, or the librarians, right, expressing concerns, right? To just dismiss all those things as some sort of, right-wing kookery, is shocking. These are not right-wing people. These are people who care about civil liberties across the board. And that, a closed mind and and a closed fist in combination are pretty scary.
Yeah, well, it does conjure up the word authoritarian for sure.
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to look at one of these. I mean, everybody I'm sure agrees that the Broadcast Act needs to be updated. There's other pieces of legislation that are associated with this, Bill C-11 on privacy concerns and issues that come around. But one of the concepts, I mean, the simplest one was the big tech companies weren't forced to contribute to the Canada Media Fund in the same way that Canadian broadcasters and companies are. And if you want them to contribute more money, whether it's for English speaking content or French speaking content, make them do it. You've got the power of the tax laws or any other piece of legislation to just say, write a check.
Oh, yeah, you can do that. I mean, they're going to start on July 1st. The GST will start being collected and remitted. Just on Netflix alone, that should be good for $50 million a year. They could just move that money over if they wanted to. Yeah. I think a bigger thing is nobody stopped to think, is doing things the way we've done them the last 40 years the right way to do things, right? There's been this entire new industry grow up of YouTubers, 25,000 people who are making more than $100,000 a year producing programming on YouTube. And they're not doing it because of the CRT's help. They're doing it because the CRTC isn't in the way, right? So, I mean, why would you, and I think there's some pretty good arguments to be made that the system as we've had it, while it's fed and watered people in the creative and production industries, hasn't really produced a lot of popular programming, right? So, yes, I mean, people say the Broadcasting Act needs to be updated. It does. I mean, my idea really is that what we need is and the BTLR panel recommended this, an entirely new entity called the Canadian Communications Commission.
Correct.
Right? And legislation based around understanding that the internet is now the primary means of communication and that sort of stuff. And you could build those things into that if you wanted to. But I mean, trying to stuff the internet into the Broadcasting Act is just, I mean, it's just stupid.
Well, and you would know better than most, but to ask the CRTC in its current form or even in a reinvented form to become the regulator of all things internet and broadcasting and to become these content control police and decide whether what I'm saying is right or not, or fair or not, or too critical of the government or not. I mean, it's an impossible task.
It pretty much is. I mean, they've given them $4 million in this year's budget just to figure out how many more people they're going to have to hire to monitor your podcast and make sure somewhere in here I've flashed my Canadian passport so I'm a Canadian guest, and that'll count against how many points you get.
We should make that clear that you're a Canadian and I'm a Canadian. We're talking about Canadian things and we're both in Canada.
That's right. That's
okay.
right. So 100%, 100% CanCon points for us today. Yeah.
This question of, and I think as I have done my reading on this notion of discoverability, which people are talking about, is kind of a Canadian concept, isn't it? Didn't that get developed at some conference that was held here? It's about finding out the source, whether there's enough Canadianness or Americanness or Frenchness or whatever it is in the content that exists online.
That's pretty much what it is. A few years ago, the CMPA, the Canadian Media Producers Association, tried to get the CRTC to have the internet service companies, your internet supplier, give preferential treatment to Canadian content. And the CRTC, of course, quite rightly said no, because that violates net neutrality. But they're still trying to, through C-10, they're kind of trying to smuggle that in. Right, so you become more discoverable. To me, I mean, I understand that perhaps in French that it feels overwhelming, when you go on and look at the streaming companies, that there's nothing in French and that sort of stuff, and there's just all this English coming in. So I have a little bit more sympathy for it there. On the English side of things, I mean, if you want to find something that's Canadian, you just go, you get that little search tool thingy and type in Canadian, and you're good. I mean, I did that on my Netflix subscription, and they pop up all the time now.
Yeah.
Right.
Simple
So
process. Yeah.
It follows. I mean, that's what those things do. Algorithms and that sort of management, I think those are good areas for regulation going forward. But in terms of discoverability, I mean, it's so easy to discover anything on the internet. You just look for what you want.
Yes, you can discover what you want, but if the government wants you to discover certain things and they start to use the algorithmic, if that's a word, the algorithmic approach. And so by definition, if they want you to discover more French content or more Canadian content, it means by definition, other things are falling down on the list. If Canadian content's coming up, and you're seeing that, other things are going down. So that's one thing for programming. Then there's the question of the discussion, and this is where it gets into censorship and the whole issue of free speech, which is if your speech is pushed up to the top because they like it better, and my speech is therefore by definition pushed down because they don't like it.
Right, then yours is being suppressed.
Exactly.
Right? You can't move somebody to the front of the queue without moving somebody further back, right? So, and freedom of expression, freedom of speech also deals with not just the freedom to say things, but the freedom to hear things, right?
Right.
And so there's definite issues there because the things that I might prefer to hear, or I might want to hear, or might just become exposed to openly on the internet, I might not get to. You know, if I have to go through the wall of approved content, right? First, it's pretty creepy.
Well, this is the slippery slope of regulation. Like I find myself, you know, I wouldn't mind some regulations on the big tech companies because they're always pushing their product. And
nobody's opposed to that, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
so let's do that. But when you start moving into, you know, the substantive content of your citizenry's commentary, you know, emails and podcasts and blogs, that's a whole other world.
Right. Yeah. If I'm worried about big tech being big brother to me, right? Yeah. It doesn't make me feel any better because the government says, don't worry, I'll be your big brother. Right? I mean, if government's going to be regulating in these areas, it needs to be regulating the gatekeepers. And that's the fundamental flaw with C-10 is it's regulating the gate kept,
right?
Which is you and me and everybody else who's listening and watching to this, right? The people posting their videos of their grandchildren or doing their podcast or doing their webcast of some kind. And just getting their voice out there. That's a wonderful thing about the internet was that you didn't have to own a TV station or a network or a newspaper anymore and try to get your little letter to the editor past, somebody who would approve of it and that sort of stuff to have your voice heard in the public square. So the great thing about social media, everybody could have their voice heard. Some of the voices we don't like very much, but so what? I mean,
but you don't have to listen to them.
You don't have to listen to them. I heard that from broadcast at the CRTC. I'd hear that from broadcasters when people talked about questionable content from time to time. They'd always say, well, if people don't like it, they can change the channel.
Yeah.
Right. So exactly. I mean, you don't like Twitter, don't go on it. Right.
Yeah. Or if you don't like the messages from somebody, block them or don't read them. Like this is not rocket science.
Yeah, I mean, you have all kinds of ways to manage your privacy and that sort of stuff. And I mean, like I said, I don't mean to condone some of those things, and those platforms are, happy to. I mean, they want to remain somewhat civil, or people will just leave from them. But yeah, like bottom line is, like I said, the government coming in to say, don't worry, we're here to help you.
We're in charge.
Yeah, we'll make sure, everybody's nice to each other is kind of, that's just creepy.
I was surprised this week because the minister made, another one of these kind of comments which seemed bizarre, which was that there was a public demand for essentially for censorship, for them to come in and do this. So I responded to that and said, there's no great hue and cry. There's no public demand for censorship. And even the response on Twitter, because sometimes in Canada, I feel like because we don't have that American Constitution with the right to free speech, that sometimes we don't care about it as much. But I was heartened this week that so many people responded to even a simple concept that they don't want censorship. They think they can make those decisions for themselves.
Yeah, he's not right, because most people don't. There's been, sometimes we all know with surveys, you can get the answer depending on how you ask the question.
Yeah.
But even if he was right, so what?
Yeah.
Having civil rights isn't about what most people want.
Right.
It's about defending your rights despite what most people want. Exactly. Right? Like if most people, thought, I can't think of an analogy right now, but if most people thought I should be in jail, right?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't make them right. I still have my rights.
Yes, exactly.
To not be in jail, right? It's just that's when he comes out with things like that. That's what really gives me the creeps, right? That he doesn't seem to understand the concept of the Charter of Rights and Rights, and freedom of expression rights, and all the other liberties that go with it.
I mean, that's the very basic point of free speech, is that if I want mine, I have to let you have yours, even though I may vehemently disagree with you.
Right. And I may say, I disagree.
Yeah.
Without being punished.
Right.
By the government, without being removed from the conversation, right? Just be able to say that. There's lots of laws measuring exactly how you can say that, and how you can express yourself. And, and the bars are pretty high, and that's fine. But the idea that the majority says Peter must shut up.
Yeah, because we don't like what he says.
Right.
Where do you think this is going to go? I mean, they've got the support of the Bloc and other parties. So even in a minority government, they could get this passed if they wanted. Then what would have to happen? I mean, is the CRTC going to have to, take its millions of dollars there and say, and figure out that they can't really do this, or that they don't want to do this? Is there any other mechanism for being the counter to the lobbyists that are being so effective on this bill?
Well, I mean, the CRTC would have to launch not just one process, but a series of protests, because numerous things within the bill are undefined. I mean, it would have to define social media, for instance. It would have to carve out its own scope, decide whether it was going to regulate everything, or what it was going to start with, or where it was going to begin, that sort of stuff. It would have to have consultations, of a public process, one hopes, as opposed to the parliamentary secret process
that we're seeing
of consultation, where people would again have the opportunity, as they've had the past couple of months, to engage. I mean, my concern is that they just get the usual suspects in that they've been seeing for the last 40 years. And then it would be challenged. This will absolutely be challenged in court. I mean, there's no question about that, in at least two different ways, regarding its constitutionality. And then the CRTC proceedings themselves would likely get challenged. And what you're going to see is, after having had 10 wonderful years of prosperity in the Canadian film and television production industry, you're going to see investment freeze up, right? Yeah. Even last year, according to the CMPA stats, the industry shrank by 2%, which was the first time in a long time, pretty much COVID related, right? But foreign investment was up by 5 or 6%, which saved it from being worse than it was. Okay, that foreign investment is not going to be as interested. I can't speak for them. I don't know them. Yeah. But in a regulatory environment as uncertain as Canada's, right? Where they don't know. I mean, they've been investing in the Canadian film and television industry for 10 years at high levels, lots of jobs, lots of productivity, that sort of stuff. And now they're just getting slapped around. I'm afraid at the end of the day, the length of process for the CRTC will take 7 to 8 years. it'll be that long before any of these groups see a nickel.
Because it's going to take so long to settle it, and it will have to go through the courts.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I mean it's a series of processes. I mean,
Yeah.
the CRTC's just finished a process involving wholesale access rates for small internet companies, and it's 6 years and going.
Yeah.
Right. It actually goes back to it actually 8, 9 years if you want to track it back. These things their process is really long. So if you wanted to, like, that's one of the things you could have done in a new Communications Act is get some regulatory zip in these processes and that sort of stuff. So,
well,
I mean,
it's
just about power. Right.
Well, that's what trouble. I mean, in the second part of the podcast today, we're talking about Bill C-15, the UNDRIP, bill to embrace the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It too is so ill-defined or unclear, and there's going to be a long process in the courts. Like, we keep shooting ourselves in the foot for inviting foreign investment to come in to help us grow and build the economy that we so desperately need.
Yeah, and it's too bad because a lot of this is lack of consultation. Like in C-10, I mean, they could have corrected a lot of, I mean, they didn't consult at all with the YouTubers. I mean, the 160,000 Canadians, right, upload content to YouTube. 160,000, right?
They probably had a view.
They might have had a point of view. You might have learned something, right? But they just listened to the people they wanted to listen because it just makes it so very obvious that it's just a political thing, right? And it's just about fighting for votes with the bloc, and that's no way to run a country. But honestly, with this and some of the other bills, just the process alone, it's like it's amateur night at the Bijou. It really is.
Peter, good to talk to you, and we'll talk again on this because it ain't over yet.
Yeah, well, it'll be in the Senate on Wednesday, I think. So hopefully the Senate will manage the process with a little bit more dignity than's occurring right now.
And try and do what we're supposed to do, which is sober second thought, and maybe hear from some of those people who are part of it.
And then maybe people can find out what the bill actually says.
It may be too secret for us to look at as well. We don't know. Maybe we won't be allowed to look at it.
Exactly. It might be too secret for the Senate.
Thanks so much. Peter Menzies spent 10 years on the CRTC, the Final Four as vice chairman of telecommunications. So he actually knows what he's talking about on this stuff. Really great to connect again. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks very much. Take care. Have a great weekend.
And stay with us. As I said, we're going to change gears, but not really, and take a look at what is going on with the government's legislation on UNDRIP, the constitutional questions there, which will be many. So in just a minute, Dwight Newman. Well, as I said at the top of the podcast today, our theme is really words matter. They're really, really important, and we need to define them, whether we're talking about broadcasting or other laws. And in this case, we're talking about the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we'll probably just call that UNDRIP from here on in, just so it will be more efficient. This is a UN declaration, and the government has said through its Bill C-15 that it wants to make it a law in Canada. This is another one of the huge constitutional issues. So we have turned to Dr. Dwight Newman, Canadian Research Chair in Indigenous Rights in Constitution and International Law, and a professor at the University of Saskatchewan College of Law. So welcome to you, Dr. Newman. It's a real pleasure.
Oh, well, I'm glad to be here.
Great. So here we are as a parliament looking at this particular law, C-15. You testified several times the last time the government brought this forward in a different bill. You had some serious concerns about that one at the time. What are you thinking about Bill C-15 now?
Well, Bill C-15 has one major change from Bill C-262, which is, it gets a little technical, but in essence, one of the most ambiguous provisions of it, or the one that had the least predictable effects, was in a section of the statute that could go into immediate operation on Bill C-262, possibly. And it's now been put in a purpose clause, which would mean that it applies just to the interpretation of the legislation.
Okay. All right, so hold the phone there.
Okay.
Let's try and tell everybody what that exactly means, because the understanding of some is that this now impacts every Canadian law, and that it actually has precedent, or there's a veto over any new or existing laws that come forward. So tell us what that difference means between 262 and this new C-15 as you understand it.
So as I understand it, the courts are not positioned to immediately start applying the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. However, Parliament is committing to a process where UNDRIP would lead to the modification, probably, of all Canadian law. So there are major consequences ahead, but there are further steps to be taken on the road.
Okay, so what does that mean? So there's an existing law on the books about whatever it may be, immigration policy or health issues of some kind, the pandemic, you know, there are laws on the books. If UNDRIP came into effect, or when it comes into effect, what does that mean?
So when Bill C-15 comes into effect, assuming that it does, it means that the government is committing to modifying Canadian laws to try to be consistent with this declaration. And it covers everything. I mean, a lot of people talk about free, prior, and informed consent as a key part of UNDRIP, which it is, but it has provisions on land rights, it has provisions on religious freedom of Indigenous peoples, all kinds of things. And so there's going to be a long process of sorting out what laws need to be changed to achieve what this bill is demanding. There's a lot of work ahead.
All right, so I'm just going to go through some of the language here, because we're asking you to do the translation today from law professor and constitutional expert to mere mortals here trying to figure out what it does. The bill affirms that the UNDRIP, that the United Nations Declaration, has application in Canadian law and provides a framework for the federal government to ensure that its laws are consistent with it. So that's what you're just saying. Now, as a government, as a country, we must look at every single law that's enacted in this country, regardless of the topic or subject matter, to see if it is consistent with UNDRIP.
In essence, yeah. I mean, that clause you've just described, that's describing the purpose. And then the next two sections say that the government's committing to all necessary measures to make Canadian law consistent with UNDRIP. And it's committing to this process of an action plan to figure out how to do that. And there's a 3-year timeline for that, which again goes back to there's a lot of work ahead, but there's a lot in the declaration and a lot in Canadian law to try to put together.
Now, what have we learned from the province of British Columbia? Because they, as a province, said, okay, we're adopting UNDRIP, we accept it, their legislature ruled on that. Have we seen anything in BC that would give us some signposts or guideposts as to what it means?
Surprisingly little, because the progress has been very slow on their action plan. So we don't see a lot from that. And what we have seen is the ways that people went and interpreted the bill right after it was enacted were more far apart than I think people were expecting. And so people have been trying to take the BC legislation into court and argue for an immediate application, even though it was worded to try to avoid that. Courts haven't accepted that, but I mean, we can't learn a lot from the BC experience other than there's a lot of unpredictability ahead.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's go back and dissect some of this a little bit more. So the Declaration's 46 articles, it says, and this is our understanding of it, they do not create new rights. Instead, they have elaborated upon existing international human rights and all the instruments to apply to Indigenous peoples, to give them, I don't know, specific protections when it comes to cultural, historical, economic circumstances. That's extremely confusing for somebody who's not a lawyer.
Sure. So the declaration comes out of a multi-decade process of Indigenous peoples working on it first. And they had a 1994 draft, and then different governments around the world entered into negotiations on this. A lot got changed from that because governments wouldn't accept it, and then there were late changes to it. But what it's trying to do is to say, what does it mean in the specific circumstances of Indigenous peoples to apply the other human rights covenants from the international level? So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights spawned these two covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And then there's some others, and Canada is a party to these various treaties. And UNDRIP isn't a treaty, but it's this declaration that in some negotiation has been sort of what do these other treaties mean in the context of Indigenous peoples? That's sort of what it's trying to say
Can
there.
you give us an example of, for example?
Sure. So, well, I'll give the example of religious freedom, say. And so in international treaties, there are short descriptions. So the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, there would be a section about the right to believe and to manifest religion and a few other things this stuff, but not a lot of details, nothing that would say, well, what does that mean for repatriation of human remains in cultures where that's significant, or what does it mean for burial sites, or what does it mean for access to sacred sites. And so UNDRIP has some specific things on those things and gives some more detail on religious freedom in Indigenous contexts. That would be a simpler example, I guess.
Yeah.
We
Well,
could
I mean,
have some more complicated ones.
That it's very timely, of course, given the horrific discovery at Kamloops. And there's differing calls from Indigenous people across this country. Some people want to preserve the site. Some people want it excavated so that they can actually find out the numbers, the true numbers, et cetera. So would UNDRIP make a difference in that? Isn't that something that all Canadians are going to have to weigh in on?
Yeah, I mean, UNDRIP might not provide a clear answer to everything. On that, though, it'll provide some answers to some things. That's a pretty specific article.
Yeah.
And I sort of latched onto one of those to give a more specific example. The more contentious pieces that arise with UNDRIP are things like the fact that then it says that on various kinds of government decisions, there needs to be cooperation and consultation in order to obtain free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous peoples to various kinds of developments. What that means is debated. What it means in UNDRIP is debated, and I published an article on sort of two rival interpretations of whether it's actually necessary to obtain consent or just to try to under those articles. And yeah, that's tricky.
That is some of the responses from Indigenous communities. It's not just about listening to us complain or make our case or statement, and then you sit there and nod your head and carry on with what you're doing, sort of one interpretation, or is it actually a veto?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, you'll hear from a lot of Indigenous peoples that they don't like the word veto because it implies they would withhold consent unreasonably. At the same time, people do use it as a shorthand. If it's necessary to obtain consent, to do a certain thing, ultimately then it can't be done unless the Indigenous peoples who are meant to consent do agree, and so it would get called by shorthand a veto. And that shifts power over a lot of decisions in Canada. If UNDRIP is fully implemented in accordance with certain interpretations of those articles. And that's one of the things people are talking about. And I mean, apart from sort of the ideas in it that a lot of people might agree with, there's also the risk of how will some people use that. And we've seen some pretty challenging situations on resource projects where rights might have been deployed a bit strategically around sort of environmental issues that matter to a lot of people too, but that aren't straightforwardly about the Indigenous issues that that the duty to consult might have started out as being about. So there's a lot of complications.
Yeah, and it's awkward to even use the phrase, you know, Indigenous peoples, in the sense that you have a wide range of views inside that population, just as you do inside Canada. There's lots of, you can't just say Canadians believe, because, you know, there's a whole range of ideas. So how do we even begin to sort that out? Like, what constitutes consultation with Indigenous people?
Right. Well, on consultation, we at least have a lot of court decisions over the last 15 years. This is one of the worries that some have had, that are we throwing out the duty to consult analysis that the courts have worked so hard at? And one of the big challenges is just who's going to be consulted or consent obtained from. Does the word Indigenous people mean the same groups, organized in the same way as we've been working with at the sort of the individual First Nation level, or does it imply something different? And that's going to be something to be sorted out as well. But questions around who represents who and so on, we can't really avoid those, as we saw with the Wet'suwet'en issues.
Yes, and the hereditary chiefs versus the elected chiefs.
Exactly.
So how do you even start to sort that out? Where do, in this plan that will commence once the bill has received assent, then what do we do? Like, what's the first step?
Well, there's going to have to be a lot of discussions between the government and different Indigenous representatives and communities somehow. And I don't know a simple way to describe how that gets going, but there's going to have to be a lot of people coming together to try to chart out a path forward. And I hope the government's been thinking about it already, because if they haven't, I mean, even figuring out how to get underway is going to take some time.
Well, I think that is part of the problem. The first time we started discussing this, both, you know, in the Senate and in Parliament and in the country, was that this was in some ways just an aspirational document. It was to say, yes, we agree in principle that the Indigenous community must be part of the decision-making process, and we're going to attempt to do that. But this is now different. This is now saying laws, decision-making on everything, including resource projects, must be done with full consultation and agreement of Indigenous communities. And that's a whole different thing, particularly if it, even a 3-year implementation process is not a long time.
Right. Well, the implementation will be over the coming decades, one could anticipate, but the planning over the next 3 years. I guess the UN declaration remains a more aspirational document at international law, or what's sometimes called soft law. It's sort of a statement of where things are being expressed as, but it's not legally binding. And I think anyone that that thinks about it from an international law perspective would agree with that. What's happening now is Canada is saying that it's passing a statute that commits Canada in its domestic law to making all these changes in response to this particular document. And so that will be a legal requirement now for Canada to go ahead and do that. And there are all kinds of challenging questions ahead in terms of how does Canada reach that action plan, and what happens if some people disagree with it? Can they challenge it in court? All kinds of things. And I mean, it affects not just Indigenous peoples, but everyone. And of course, in resource sectors, it affects resource companies pretty directly, and they're going to want to be part of the discussions on the action plan. I guess hopefully we're through the pandemic before they have to put a lot of resources into teams that are going to be discussing this action plan. But there's a lot that stems from this bill.
That's one of the issues, of course, that's there. And we can cite lots of specific examples of research or resource projects, and of course, pipelines, et cetera. But it does mean, as we have this conversation now, this is a very uncertain climate for businesses to try and make any decision whether they want to develop a particular project or put money or back a particular project when they don't know the climate or the circumstance in which they will be operating.
Indeed. I mean, it's been an uncertain climate before Bill C-15, and Bill C-15 adds another layer of some uncertainties that, I mean, there are some real challenges for business and investment in the current climate in Canada. And that's not necessarily a great thing for Indigenous peoples themselves. There were Indigenous representatives that appeared at the committees to oppose the bill out of a few different things. Some said that they hadn't been consulted about it.
Right.
And so ironically, it wouldn't meet its own standards. Now, legally, it doesn't need to yet because it's not yet enforced.
Right.
But that speaks to some of the challenges ahead in future. But then some that are involved with the resource industry and see that that's the largest source of jobs for many Indigenous communities, expressed some concerns about the risks that could come from it. So it's overall very symbolically important to a lot of Indigenous people in Canada, but there's a nuanced discussion to be had about it in a lot of ways too. And I mean, there's also been, for lack of a better word, a critique from the Indigenous left that are sort of saying, well, this will constrain their sovereignty that they thought that they had, and so on. And that's a different argument altogether. So it's a pretty complicated, nuanced conversation underway.
Well, because there's still some very basic questions when we talk about First Nations themselves and self-government. Even those definitions are not yet clear.
That's right. I mean, there's some things that are clearer than others, and some things temporarily clear.
Yeah.
I mean, this bill is going to surely have to call for a whole-scale revision of the Indian Act. And that's been talked about for decades. No one's really been able to achieve agreement on what would replace it. So then, because there are some things that you can't just leave a vacuum on the governance structure or legal empowerment for governance structures, or you can't just leave a vacuum on what law applies to various matters that it does cover. Even while everyone recognizes that it's very paternalistic in a lot of ways and needs change. But if we've been struggling for decades on how to do that, maybe there hasn't been a sustained conversation. Maybe Bill C-15 supports that, but it's a tall measure to say, well, in the next 3 years, there's going to be a plan sorted out how to do this, and even to get it done over the next couple of decades. There's some challenges, but I guess some changes are needed, and the hope is by its proponents that C-15 would lead to those.
So as which I guess will have to happen. I was just listening to Jody Wilson-Raybould on that question. There has to be an elimination over time of the Indian Act. It has to be dismantled, but there are certain protections for Indigenous people that still exist in that act. So you've got to kind of take that out piece by piece as you're layering on this other set of rules.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the Indian Act deals just with First Nations and only with certain First Nations.
Right.
And then there are First Nations or non-status Indians, sometimes the terminology goes, that are outside the Indian Act. And then there are, of course, Métis and Inuit peoples in Canada that aren't in the Indian Act, and sort of what are the frameworks for everybody, and what do you do about the fact that there are historical treaties, there are modern treaties, and then there are non-treaty situations, and each of those has some distinctive features. And I mean, I don't want to just make things sound more and more difficult, but I just want people to be aware that there are some complex things ahead in terms of even the circumstances that legally apply right now in different contexts.
Well, even
And, yeah.
the changes to the citizenship oath being discussed to recognize Indigenous rights and treaties, but a lot of those treaties are disputed not only in the courts, but amongst and between Indigenous groups themselves. So even, I keep coming back to this, words matter, and it's hard to capture those subtle differences.
Well, there can be some challenges capturing subtle differences in a short bill. And yeah, Bill C-15, I'll say, has one of the longest preambles I've ever seen in a bill. And the preamble is multiple times the length of the actual operative sections of the bill itself, which generate a lot of change with a very small number of words, and hopefully they're the right words, because words do matter.
So on that topic, if I can just shift for a moment. So Quebec has declared that it wants to become a nation with French as its only official language, and that they want to make a unilateral change to the Constitution in order to make that happen. Are they talking about the Constitution to which they are not a signature?
Sort of, yes. So one can see some ironies in this. At the same time, legally, Quebec is part of the Canadian Constitution.
Right.
And most of their members of Parliament voted for the Canadian Constitution and represented Quebec in that vote. It is a long-staying grievance that they didn't, as a province, sign on at the time. But according to the rules on constitutional change, the Constitution Act 1982 legally came into force, and it does apply to Quebec and so on. They're trying to use one of the amending formulae there. They claim they're changing only their provincial constitution with these changes, even though the bit of the provincial constitution they're talking about is in the Constitution Act 1867 on their argument. The real question is, are they changing something that's more about the Constitution of Canada than just the provincial Constitution of Quebec? And there are some grounds for skepticism about their arguments about the change they're making. So,
well, it's just, I mean, if they are to declare themselves a nation, we don't actually have a definition of that internally inside Canada.
No, we don't have a definition for that. I mean, the federal parliament has also passed a symbolic bill recognizing Quebec as a nation.
Well, they've recognized Quebecers as a people, which is kind of a different thing, right?
Sure. Yeah, you're right to say the words here matter. So yes. Yeah. I think the provision Quebec's inserting, if they can legally put it in, it's basically symbolic. If it affects other provinces, then it's beyond their powers. So it's symbolic, but words matter, even symbolic words, and courts might use those in some way around interpretation. And as you say, we don't have a definition of a nation or what the implications of that would be. We've been through similar debates before in 1987 when there was discussion about Quebec as a distinct society. Right. That would have had more dramatic effects, perhaps, because it was going to be a change passed through the unanimity formula by the federal government and all the provinces if it had been put in through the Meech Lake Accord. But at the end of the day, yeah, I mean, it's the same kind of struggle, and Quebec's trying to do something on that to do something at least symbolically, and some of it might come down to some political maneuvering too.
Right.
Yeah.
But it does seem to be kind of opening up the floodgates when you hear Premier Kenny and even Premier Moe say, okay, great, you go ahead with that, Quebec, because that sort of opens the doors for us to declare that we are distinct and unique in our particular approach to governing and living and doing business and all of those things. A different, perhaps a slightly different definition of culture, but nevertheless it is. I think Westerners feel different than Central Canadians, and there's differences with East Coasters and all of that brings us all together. So is it possibly kind of opening the constitutional floodgates a bit, even the referendum on equalization?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's an interesting precedent. Well, both of those are interesting precedents in terms of how could others build creatively upon them in other ways.
Right.
We're into a period, the last few years, where suddenly there are pressures pulling Canada apart in little ways. And I don't want to overstate that, but I
No,
don't
but
want to understate it either. I mean,
that's
there's a
correct. Yeah.
surprising number of votes now for separatist parties in the prairies. There are these new pressures in Quebec. I mean, we shouldn't laugh these off. These are
Oh,
real
exactly.
things in terms of things sort of pulling a bit at Canada. And so even, I mean, maybe they were justified, but the mobility restrictions between provinces during COVID sort of pulled the country apart a little bit, as compared to a vision where people could travel freely through the country.
Yeah.
And there were circumstances that led to that, but each little thing is pulling some things apart. And we went through a period where there weren't a lot of things that were pulling Canada apart. The federal government wasn't imposing central policies quite as much for a while, and that sort of kept the peace. And the last few years, the federal government has wanted to pursue more centralized policies on various matters, and that leads to pressures that pull things apart a little bit. And then you had some unique circumstances, obviously, with COVID that have come in too. But there's something going on here that's not to be just ignored.
Well, I think that's, and we've had lots of discussions about that in the wake of the budget, that and the kind of spending that we saw throughout the pandemic, much of which was needed, but which now appears that it's going to continue. So, you know, a little bit more of an interventionist approach from Ottawa. And at the same time, as you say, during the pandemic, seeing 10, sometimes 13 very different approaches to how to respond and how to deal with this issue because of, again, constitutionally jurisdictional differences, right?
Right. I mean, those are the constitutional rights of the provinces to pursue their policies. But in some other environment, we might have seen more cooperation take place, or more ability to draw people together from different parts of the country around some common policies through non-coercive means, but through sort of voluntary discussion. And we didn't really see as much as that as one might have in some other circumstance.
Well, I'm looking at a headline here as our conversation comes to an end, from the Justice Minister saying consent is impossible to define. When questioned about Bill C-15. So I've got a feeling we're going to be coming back to you from time to time to see if you can interpret progress or even tell us if there's been any in terms of sorting out what this means.
Well, I'd be happy to try to talk about it again as this moves forward, because
what are you and your community, and I mean constitutional law experts in Canada, of which you were one, how are you taking this on? Are you as a group or a community trying to sort this out? Yes, you come and testify at Senate committees and House of Commons committees and you write papers. Is there any concerted effort, or does it actually first have to take a court challenge before you can inject your views?
Right. Well, those that work on pure constitutional law might not be engaged with this as closely. A lot of my work is on Indigenous rights in international law and Indigenous rights and natural resources. And so I'm thinking about these things all the time. There are various, I guess I'd say, sub-communities of people that are working together in different ways, probably trying to say some things about what this might mean. I'm not involved with it, but there's a research group that is working on a grant where they're trying to say what would replace the Indian Act. And I think there are a couple dozen scholars involved with that, many of them Indigenous. And so if they come to some creative answers, that could feed into what happens after Bill C-15. But I mean, partly academics work a lot on our own and present a lot of contrasting views to try to help with discussion or just to try to help interpret things. And we trust to parliamentary committees to bring things together, or I guess whoever the action plan group is. But it won't be just academics involved in this.
Yeah.
I mean, Indigenous communities and peoples obviously are going to be involved, but also resource sector companies, I'm sure, are going to have teams dedicated to this. I mean, there's a lot of work ahead.
So with all this uncertainty and huge fat question marks beside everything, do you think it's the right way to go?
Oh, that's a really tough question to sum up with, because at a symbolic level, I think it is important legislation. I would have preferred personally more definition and clarity and planning ahead. And so Bill C-262, I expressed that concern and thought that it needed to be clarified. Because some of those things were clarified, I'm more comfortable with C-15, but I wish more were defined and better defined than is the case. But it's really symbolically important, and I think there are important steps ahead for Canada. So I try to have a nuanced view on it in a sense, and think in a lot of ways this has the potential for a good thing, with a lot of risks with it, and I wish we could have avoided some of the risks. But assuming it is passed, let's all work with it as effectively as we can, realizing that it is important to rebuild relationships with Indigenous communities and to foster conditions for Indigenous people in Canada and everyone in Canada to have better futures ahead.
Thanks so much, Dr. Newman. I know this is a tough one, and we're kind of figuring it out as we all go along collectively here. So thanks for your insights. It's really helpful.
Sure, thank you.
Great. Dr. Dwight Newman is the Canadian Research Chair in Indigenous Rights in Constitutional International Law, and he's a professor at the University of Saskatchewan College of Law. He's got a whole other list of credentials too, so check him out and you'll figure that out. Thanks again for your time. That's it for No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We'll see you again soon.